Today's story explores three harrowing cases of abuse, captivity, and survival that shocked the world. A young woman breaks free after years of being trapped in a twisted cycle of lies and manipulation. A brave girl escapes her captor after witnessing the unthinkable, and a hidden house of horrors reveals the unimaginable suffering of 13 siblings. These stories are as heartbreaking as they are inspiring, showcasing the strength of survivors against overwhelming odds. But before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload daily, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. The night was unusually still for June in Springfield, Missouri. A faint hum of cicadas filled the air, as quiet as could be expected in this sleepy town. Inside her modest home on West Volunteer Way, Dee Dee Blanchard lay motionless in her bedroom, an unsettling stillness marking her form in the dim light of the room. The first person to suspect something was terribly wrong was Kim Blanchard, a family friend. Over the years, Kim had often checked in on Dee Dee and her daughter, Gypsy Rose, who faced countless medical issues, or so everyone thought. Dee Dee was a dedicated mother, always doting on Gypsy and tirelessly tending to her needs. Their relationship, to most people, was inseparable, filled with late-night hospital visits and fundraisers for Gypsy's medical expenses. But that day, Kim sensed a shadow looming over the house, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Several days had passed since anyone had heard from Dee Dee, or Gypsy. Kim found herself staring at the peculiar Facebook post from Dee Dee's account. "That bitch is dead." This bizarre message cast a dark cloud of confusion over Dee Dee's friends and family, leaving them worried and, frankly, frightened. They wondered if it was a cruel joke, or maybe Dee Dee's account had been hacked. But the more people saw it, the less they could dismiss the chilling sense that something had gone deeply, irreversibly wrong. It was Kim who finally decided that the mystery needed to be unraveled. She reached out to others, and together they formed a small group, ready to confront whatever lay behind Dee Dee's front door. As they approached the quiet home, that Facebook post replayed in their minds, a haunting echo that grew louder with every step. Standing at the doorstep, they knocked, called out, and waited. Silence pressed against their ears. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was an overwhelming feeling of emptiness that none of them had ever felt in this house before. After no answer, the decision was made to call the police. When the authorities arrived, they too were puzzled. The air grew thicker with tension as officers carefully forced the door open, breaking into the silence. Inside, the smell was the first sign that something terrible had occurred. The living room was untouched, almost frozen in time, like a scene from any other quiet day in the Blanchard household. But further in, the stillness turned eerie, and the sense of dread intensified with every passing second. Moving through the hall and into Dee Dee's bedroom, the officers found her there, lying still. The details were too grim to process all at once. It was as though every assumption about the Blanchards' world shattered instantly, the layers of a carefully constructed image stripped away to reveal a reality darker than anyone could have anticipated. As news of Dee Dee's death spread, confusion grew within the community. Dee Dee was known for her unwavering dedication to Gypsy, who, by all accounts, had endured a lifetime of suffering. Gypsy's absence heightened the mystery. Where was she? Had she been taken? Was she in danger? Or, worse, had something happened to her as well? These questions echoed through the town, and among those who knew the Blanchards, especially Kim, who felt an ever-growing fear for Gypsy's safety. With each passing hour, the strange, cryptic Facebook message loomed over everyone, fueling theories and rumors about the events that had unfolded behind the Blanchards' closed doors. Investigators worked quickly, tracing leads and interviewing everyone they could. The disappearance of Gypsy Rose became the focus. As each hour passed, the possibility that she was in grave danger seemed more likely. Friends and neighbors who once saw Gypsy as a sweet, quiet young woman, confined to a wheelchair, a girl dependent on her mother for survival, struggled to comprehend the gravity of what might have happened. There was a collective urgency to find her, a relentless drive among law enforcement and the community alike. The hours turned to days, and the investigation pointed them towards social media, where authorities discovered a peculiar set of interaction. Gypsy, as it turned out, had been in contact with a young man named Nicholas Gaudijon. The two had exchanged messages online, messages that took on new meaning in the light of recent events. The nature of their conversations hinted at a depth and intensity that no one expected. Gypsy's seemingly sheltered life took on a sudden, dark complexity, one that painted her in a new light and added layers to the growing mystery. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a series of communications that outlined Gypsy's friendship with Nicholas, a relationship that quickly revealed itself as more than a passing acquaintance. These interactions suggested an unsettling level of secrecy, and perhaps a budding plan that went beyond the innocent image Gypsy had long projected to the world. Her online world unraveled, revealing corners of her life unknown to her mother and the community around her. Soon, the authorities discovered that Gypsy and Nicholas were not simply acquaintances. They were involved in an intense and hidden relationship. And as they pieced together more details, one thing became disturbingly clear. Gypsy had played a part in her mother's death. It was a twist no one saw coming. The delicate young woman, thought to be completely dependent on Dee Dee, appeared to have harbored a deep-rooted desire for freedom. The only way out of the life she led seemed to her to be the most drastic one. In the days that followed, investigators dove deeply into the strange world Gypsy had crafted, one carefully hidden behind her mother's walls and within the digital realm. Each revelation turned the public's perception of Gypsy from that of a fragile, innocent child to someone far more complex, driven, and perhaps desperate. As police retraced Gypsy's steps, they uncovered the messages between her and Nicholas Gaudijon. These messages had grown darker over time, tinged with a shared urgency and plans that were alarmingly clear in hindsight. In these exchanges, Nicholas was not merely a distant boyfriend, but an accomplice in a scheme that shocked everyone. For years, Dee Dee had tightly controlled every aspect of Gypsy's life. The hospital trips, the medications, the devices meant to aid mobility, all were managed with meticulous care by Dee Dee. Yet, here was a secret that had flourished under Dee Dee's very nose. Her daughter's yearning for freedom, one she believed could only be gained by extreme means. Nicholas himself seemed an unlikely match for Gypsy, someone who had always been presented as delicate and unable to fend for herself. But as detectives gathered more details, they began to piece together the underlying dynamics of their relationship. Nicholas, who also had his own set of unique struggles, appeared to be easily influenced, seemingly swayed by Gypsy's appeals for help and companionship. In Gypsy, he found purpose. In Nicholas, Gypsy found the courage to defy her mother's overwhelming control. The investigators looked back through Gypsy's communications, uncovering the outlines of a relationship that went far beyond mere online flirtations. Their messages were filled with coded language and references to a plan, hinting at their shared resentment toward Dee Dee's authority. The intensity of their conversations made clear that Gypsy's dependence on Nicholas had deepened into something dangerously resolute, her desire for freedom taking a dark, unwavering focus. The authorities, meanwhile, were growing more cautious with their discoveries. They faced the grim reality that Gypsy was no helpless victim in this scenario. She was implicated as a key player. As they examined the chain of messages, a story emerged. This wasn't simply a spontaneous crime. Gypsy and Nicholas had spent months plotting, envisioning a future where Dee Dee was no longer in control, a future where Gypsy could finally live as she pleased. And Nicholas, who had grown emotionally and mentally attached, had become her willing accomplice, prepared to go to whatever lengths Gypsy believed necessary. Back in Springfield, the shock of Dee Dee's death had begun to settle into disbelief. Friends, neighbors, and even distant family members struggled to reconcile the image of Gypsy Rose as a potential conspirator in a crime that left her mother dead. This was a young woman who had always appeared fragile, whose life seemed confined to a wheelchair, doctor's appointments, and a mother who doted on her constantly. But that familiar image dissolved with each new detail, leaving behind only questions. How could a daughter turn on the very person who had, by all accounts, given her everything? It didn't take long before authorities tracked Gypsy and Nicholas to a small home in Wisconsin, where they had hung out. When they arrived, Gypsy was nothing like the wheelchair-bound girl from Springfield. She walked out on her own, the very sight of her on her feet like a revelation that shattered everything Dee Dee had built. The reality of her health and abilities, hidden for so long, now stood in stark contrast to the stories that had been carefully constructed around her. Each step she took toward the police was a silent declaration. Her life had been a prison, and this was the means she'd chosen to escape it. As Gypsy was taken into custody, investigators began peeling back the layers of her life in Springfield. They discovered that Dee Dee had orchestrated a carefully fabricated story, detailing her daughter's supposed ailments, medical conditions, and disabilities. Dee Dee had painted Gypsy as a chronically ill young woman who suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, and an assortment of other conditions, leaving her supposedly wheelchair-bound and dependent. This image garnered support from local organizations and even led to generous donations. Many people, unaware of the truth, had come forward to help Dee Dee and Gypsy financially. The support ranged from free trips and stays to substantial donations, all with the assumption that they were aiding a family burdened by relentless hardship. As interviews with doctors, neighbors, and close family members continued, detectives began to understand the full extent of Dee Dee's control. Gypsy's entire life had been scripted, every moment orchestrated by a mother who used her as a pawn in an elaborate narrative of illness. And yet, as they combed through records and spoke to people who had known Dee Dee, the investigators began to see the toll that this carefully crafted image had taken on Gypsy. Her years in Dee Dee's care had been marked by manipulation, isolation, and the gradual erosion of her sense of self. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence against her, Gypsy's demeanor remained calm, almost relieved as she spoke with detectives. With each revelation, her story painted Dee Dee as an unrelenting presence, one who denied Gypsy's freedom in the guise of love and protection. To Gypsy, the illusion of illness had been both her mother's weapon and her prison, and Nicholas represented the only escape she could envision. In her interview with police, Gypsy recounted how she had first connected with Nicholas online. For a girl who had been restricted from friends, relationships, and basic freedoms, he was like an open window to the world. Their bond grew quickly, fueled by an overwhelming need for companionship and a shared frustration with the limitations placed upon them. Over time, they began to speak about more than their daily lives. They spoke about what life would be like without Dee Dee's constant presence, how freeing it would be for Gypsy to live without a caregiver, to be seen as independent and self-sufficient. But the dreams of freedom quickly turned into a dark resolve as both believed that there was only one way to make that vision a reality. The story investigators were piecing together grew more complex with each new interview. Dee Dee, Gypsy's recounting of her life, under Dee Dee's care, portrayed an existence controlled down to the smallest detail. This wasn't merely a case of an overprotective mother. It was a life shaped by a woman who had cast Gypsy as a perpetual victim, all while hiding the truth of her daughter's abilities and confining her under the guise of love and protection. As authorities spoke with doctors who had treated Gypsy over the years, they uncovered Dee Dee's systematic manipulation of medical records and doctor visits. Despite mounting inconsistencies in Gypsy's diagnoses, Dee Dee managed to weave her story so tightly that few thought to question it. Some medical professionals noted the disconnect between Gypsy's reported symptoms and what they observed, but Dee Dee was convincing, a mother advocating fiercely for her sick child. Over time, Dee Dee's carefully constructed reality became nearly impossible to dispute, even as certain doctors harbored doubts. For years, she had perfected the art of persuasion, relying on Gypsy's appearance and her own determined insistence to silence any question. For Gypsy, the only escape from this fabricated reality was her relationship with Nicholas. Her secret online life became her only source of agency and control, a place where she could shed the constraints Dee Dee had built around her. In Nicholas, she found someone who listened to her, someone who seemed to genuinely care and empathize. He validated her frustrations and echoed her wishes for a different life, free from the constant shadow of her mother's control. As their relationship deepened, Nicholas encouraged Gypsy's longing for freedom, believing in her portrayal of Dee Dee as an unyielding, manipulative figure who would stop at nothing to keep her daughter under her care. Together, they began to imagine a life in which they could be together openly, free from interference. And with time, this dream began to eclipse any remaining hesitation. In Nicholas, Gypsy saw not only a confidant, but a solution, someone willing to take action to help her achieve the freedom she felt she couldn't gain on her own. Investigators worked carefully to understand this twisted relationship, aware of the psychological grip Dee Dee had held over her daughter. For years, Gypsy had been deprived of any semblance of a normal life. Her days were dictated by her mother's invented needs and routines. Any attempt at independence was quashed with warnings of her fragile health, with Dee Dee reminding Gypsy of how impossible life would be without her. So deeply entrenched was Dee Dee's influence that Gypsy had never been allowed to handle money, make independent decisions, or even choose her own friends. Gypsy's relationship with Nicholas had filled a void created by years of isolation. As the police combed through their messages and interactions, they found countless exchanges in which Gypsy had voiced her desire for a new life, often wondering aloud what it would be like to make her own choices. To Nicholas, her desperation painted a portrait of a young woman cornered by circumstances she could not control, a life spent in constant surveillance. And in response, Nicholas had taken on the role of a protector, someone willing to break Gypsy free of her mother's grasp, no matter the cost. As more details emerged, the story reached a national audience, with people struggling to comprehend the layers of control and deceit woven into Gypsy's life. News reports delved into the Blanchards' background, uncovering years of fundraising efforts and charitable donations from well-meaning individuals who believed they were helping a sick child. It became clear that Dee Dee had exploited the kindness of strangers, drawing sympathy and support from organizations and individuals alike, all the while masking the reality of her daughter's health. The prosecutors faced a challenging task, untangling the moral and legal responsibilities involved. Gypsy's role in the crime was undeniable. She had plotted with Nicholas, guiding him to her home on the fateful night. Yet, with every new piece of information, it was clear that she was also a victim, her life molded by years of manipulation and psychological confinement. The legal team had to weigh not only the intent behind the crime, but the coercive environment in which Gypsy had grown up. Her psychological state became a key factor, with experts brought in to assess the impact of Dee Dee's actions on her perception of reality. In her statements to police, Gypsy recounted the events leading up to her mother's death in a matter-of-fact tone, her words bearing the weight of years spent planning her escape, albeit through means that few could condone. She described how she had felt trapped, how every attempt to assert herself had been thwarted by Dee Dee's control. And finally, she explained how she had turned to Nicholas, seeing in him the only way out. As Gypsy's case made its way to court, the public's attention turned to the complex legal proceedings and the ethical questions surrounding her role. The media grappled with the contrast between the image Dee Dee had created of a fragile, sickly daughter and the reality of a young woman fighting to break free from years of coercion and control. Experts were divided, with some insisting Gypsy's actions were the result of desperation and others viewing her as equally responsible for the crime. In court, Gypsy's defense presented a narrative of a young woman driven to extremes by her environment. Her attorneys argued that the years of medical fraud and isolation had effectively imprisoned her in a false identity that her mother had constructed. Gypsy had been made to believe she was helpless, dependent, and incapable of surviving on her own. Even the simplest aspects of daily life, from choosing her meals to managing her own medication, had been entirely under Dee Dee's control. The defense painted a picture of Gypsy as a person with no autonomy, someone molded by manipulation into accepting a life of dependency. Every attempt to question Dee Dee was met with subtle reminders of her supposed fragility, her illnesses used as a tool to maintain control. Over the years, Dee Dee's influence became so powerful that Gypsy's sense of reality was shaped entirely by her mother's narrative. In the eyes of the court, this raised an unsettling question. Was Gypsy truly responsible for her actions, or had she been a victim of her circumstances, unable to see another way out? On the opposing side, the prosecution argued that Gypsy had a clear intent to harm, with evidence of planning and coordination with Nicholas. They cited her messages to Nicholas in the days leading up to the event, in which she expressed a desire for freedom, but through increasingly drastic language. To the prosecution, this demonstrated a level of premeditation, a choice made by someone fully aware of the consequences. The prosecutors insisted that, regardless of her circumstances, Gypsy had options and that she could have sought help without resorting to such extreme actions. Witnesses were called to testify about Dee Dee's control, describing her as a forceful, often manipulative figure who rarely allowed Gypsy a moment's independence. Former neighbors, friends, and medical professionals recounted instances where Dee Dee's explanations about Gypsy's health had seemed implausible but had gone unchallenged. They described Dee Dee as fiercely protective, claiming she always knew what was best for Gypsy, even if her methods seemed excessive. But as these testimonies unfolded, a different picture emerged. One of a woman who used fear and dependence to keep her daughter confined, both physically and emotionally. The defense brought in psychologists who testified about the psychological impact of Dee Dee's influence on Gypsy's perception of herself and the world. According to these experts, Gypsy had been conditioned to believe in her limitations, her mind shaped by years of misinformation and fear. They explained how Dee Dee's actions constituted a form of psychological confinement, trapping Gypsy in a mindset of helplessness that made her reliant on her mother for survival. Gypsy herself took the stand, her appearance a stark contrast to the frail image Dee Dee had once projected. She spoke in a quiet, steady voice, describing how her life had been shaped by her mother's choices, how she had been forced to play a role for as long as she could remember. She recounted moments of defiance, attempts to assert her own will, and how Dee Dee had always countered with reminders of her weaknesses. Gypsy explained that in the end, she felt there was no other way out, that Nicholas had been the only person who had listened to her, who had understood her need to escape. Nicholas' case was even more complicated. His defense argued that he had been drawn into a situation he didn't fully comprehend, manipulated by Gypsy's pleas for help and his own limited understanding of the severity of the act. His attorneys painted a picture of a man driven by love and loyalty, someone who saw himself as Gypsy's protector and believed her claims about Dee Dee's oppressive control. The court saw videos of Nicholas during his initial police interviews, his demeanor confused, his answers often contradictory. He seemed caught between two conflicting roles, the protective boyfriend and the accused accomplice. The trial exposed the unsettling realities of the Blanchard household, laying bare the depth of Dee Dee's control and the psychological toll it had taken on Gypsy. Each day in court revealed more of the pain and desperation that had shaped her actions, and each new detail complicated the public's understanding of Gypsy's responsibility. For many, the trial was no longer simply about guilt or innocence. It was about the lines between victimhood and accountability, about how far a person might go when backed into an impossible corner. As the final days of the trial unfolded, the courtroom's intensity heightened. Gypsy's life story, one of manipulation and confinement, had captivated the nation, blurring the line between victim and participant in her mother's death. The legal teams presented their closing arguments, each determined to sway the jury with their interpretation of Gypsy's role in the tragedy. The defense made its last appeal to the jury's empathy, urging them to see Gypsy as a young woman raised in a distorted reality, stripped of autonomy and trust. They argued that her mental state had been shaped by years of abuse and confinement, and her actions were those of a person desperate for escape. Gypsy's entire life, they argued, had been shaped by one overwhelming influence, her mother. With no other support, no friends or family outside the walls Dee Dee had constructed, Gypsy's options had narrowed until she saw only one escape. The prosecution, however, argued that Gypsy had reached an age and level of awareness that made her accountable. They reminded the jury of her calculated actions, of her planning with Nicholas, and the methodical steps leading up to the night of her mother's death. They pointed out that while Gypsy had undoubtedly suffered, the law required her to answer for the choice she had made. As the jury deliberated, the courtroom remained silent. Reporters speculated and onlookers weighed their own opinions on social media. For many, Gypsy's case had exposed a societal blind spot, the ways in which someone's life could be controlled under the guise of caregiving and the consequences of those unseen abuses. But despite the public's empathy, the jury's task remained. They had to weigh the evidence and determine Gypsy's responsibility under the law. When the verdict was finally read, Gypsy was found guilty, but was granted a reduced sentence, her years of manipulation and confinement taken into account. Her sentence offered a unique balance, punishment for her involvement, but also a recognition of her victimization. Gypsy showed little reaction, her face steady as the sentence was read, as though she had come to terms with the consequences long before stepping into the courtroom. For Nicholas, the outcome was more severe. He was convicted of a more significant charge, the court finding him to be an active participant without the mitigating factors that had influenced Gypsy's sentence. His role as Gypsy's accomplice, driven by loyalty and a deep, unwavering attachment, was viewed differently under the law. His sentencing marked the conclusion of the case, but it left lingering questions about the nature of accountability and the weight of influence in situations like theirs. After the trial, Gypsy began her sentence in a world that was both foreign and oddly liberating. For the first time, she was living independently, outside the framework Dee Dee had imposed. Though her surroundings were restrictive, she found a sense of autonomy that had eluded her all her life. She pursued education, explored her interests, and began to understand herself beyond the shadow of her mother's influence. She expressed remorse for her actions, acknowledging the pain they had caused others, and hoping that in time, her story might bring awareness to others trapped in similar situations. The community, and indeed the entire country, was left reflecting on the broader implications of Gypsy's story. Medical professionals, social workers, and advocacy groups discussed the need for better checks and safeguards for vulnerable individuals, especially in cases involving long-term medical care and caregiving dynamics. The case highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority within families and raised awareness about a rare but impactful form of manipulation. As years passed, Gypsy's story continued to resonate with people who saw in her case a cautionary tale and a call for vigilance against hidden forms of control. Her story inspired documentaries, articles, and discussions that examined not just her actions but the environment that had shaped her. For Gypsy, the journey was one of self-discovery, an uncharted path toward understanding the life she had been denied. Her days were shaped by the limits of her sentence, but she embraced her newfound independence, cherishing even the small freedoms that were once unimaginable. Though the events that led her to this point were dark, Gypsy's resilience shone through. Her story, complex and heartbreaking, became a symbol of both the cost of coercion and the possibility of redemption. Her journey reminded others of the importance of seeking support, of trusting one's own reality, and of breaking free from constraints that might otherwise remain unseen. Next story is called The Brave Escape. On the night of October 15, 2018, a chill hung in the air around the Closs family's rural Wisconsin home. The night was dark and quiet, blanketed in the typical silence that settled over the remote town of Barron. Inside, 13-year-old Jayme Closs was preparing for bed. Her parents, Denise and Jayme Closs, had already started winding down for the night, unaware of the stranger quietly approaching their home. Jake Patterson, a man Jayme had never met, had driven to Barron with a dark plan in mind. He had been watching Jayme from afar, captivated by the idea of taking her and isolating her from her family and friends. Over the past several days, he had mentally prepared himself to carry out his disturbing intentions, determined not to leave without Jayme. With the road empty and no signs of activity from nearby homes, Patterson parked a distance away and cautiously approached the house. He moved quietly, his shoes barely making a sound on the gravel driveway, his gloved hands carefully gripping his flashlight. He had been meticulously planning this moment, hoping to avoid any complications that might draw attention to his actions. Patterson reached the front door and, without hesitation, attempted to force his way inside. At the sound, Jayme Closs rushed to the door. He was unaware of the imminent danger standing on the other side. Patterson's voice rang out, his words calm but chilling, demanding that Jayme open the door. Confused and alarmed, Jayme hesitated. Realizing his voice alone wasn't enough, Patterson took further measures, raising the intensity of his demands, making it clear that resistance would be futile. A struggle ensued, and the peace of the Closs home was shattered. In the moments that followed, Patterson forced his way into the home, where Denise and Jayme were hiding in the bathroom. Denise, in an act of selflessness, held Jayme close, hoping to shield her from the intruder. The fear was tangible in the small bathroom, and Denise whispered reassurances to Jayme, trying to stay calm even as the situation grew more dire. As the stranger's footsteps approached, Denise's heart pounded. She knew that her daughter's life was in danger, and her thoughts raced with any way to protect her. Patterson's footsteps grew louder as he neared the bathroom door, his intent becoming more terrifyingly clear with each passing second. There was nowhere left to go, nowhere to hide. Finally, the door opened, and Patterson's dark plan moved forward. As Jayme was taken away from her family home that night, she couldn't fully grasp the nightmare she was being thrust into. Jake Patterson's grip was firm as he led her away from everything she'd ever known, moving quickly and quietly. The journey was long, the road stretching on and on as Patterson drove deeper into the rural landscapes of Wisconsin, away from any potential help. Jayme sat silently, fear gripping her as she looked out at the dark, unfamiliar terrain. When they finally arrived, Patterson ushered her into a cabin isolated from the outside world, a place he had prepared to keep her hidden. Jayme didn't know then that her life would be confined to the walls of this small, secluded space for nearly 3 months. Patterson controlled every part of her environment, from what she saw to what she heard, ensuring that she would feel as though there was no escape. Inside the cabin, Patterson had created a strict set of rules. He emphasized how carefully she had to follow his instructions, threatening her if she disobeyed. The isolation of the cabin and the pressure of Patterson's control made Jayme feel increasingly trapped. Each day blurred into the next, with Jayme always on edge, trying to anticipate his demands. To keep her from escaping, Patterson set up measures around the cabin to make her feel completely cut off from the outside world. He covered the windows, limited her movements within the small space, and enforced a routine that kept her confined. The isolation and lack of control began to wear on Jayme, but she kept her hope alive. Deep down, she thought of her family, of the life she had left behind, and held on to the thought that someone might be looking for her, that someone might find her. When he would leave the cabin, Patterson imposed restrictions so intense that Jayme barely moved from her hiding place, afraid of what he might do if he returned and found her out of place. Even the smallest sounds would make her heart race, the silence around her amplifying her fear. But despite the dread, Jayme held on to her inner strength, finding moments of quiet courage that helped her survive. Throughout this ordeal, Jayme remained resilient. She had moments of overwhelming fear, but she also clung to the memories of her family and her life before this captivity. Even as Patterson tried to make her feel small and helpless, Jayme never fully lost hope. Somewhere inside her, she believed that she would find a way out, that she could be free again. As the days passed after Jayme's abduction, the barren community was thrust into a state of shock and disbelief. The small town, known for its quiet streets and close-knit residents, was suddenly the center of a nationwide search. News of Jayme's disappearance spread quickly, and media outlets filled with photos of the young girl with bright eyes and a shy smile. Her face appeared on posters in every shop window, on the doors of local schools, and on screens across the country. For many, the story of Jayme's sudden vanishing felt like a terrible nightmare from which they hoped to awaken. Law enforcement was relentless in its efforts to uncover the truth. The Barron County Sheriff's Department coordinated with state and federal agencies to organize search teams and publicize any leads. Community members gathered in church halls and local meeting spaces to organize searches of their own, combing through the woods and open fields, hoping for any sign of Jayme. Local law enforcement worked tirelessly, spending day after day following every potential lead, investigating countless tips that flooded in from across the state and beyond. Jayme's family and friends clung to each other, supporting one another as they faced the terrible unknown. Jayme's classmates, teachers, and neighbors gathered at vigils, holding candles and sharing memories of her, hoping that somehow their collective prayers would bring her back safely. The community was shaken, yet the search unified them in a way they had never experienced before. Even strangers, people who had never met Jayme, joined in, moved by the idea of a young girl torn away from her life. Despite the mounting efforts, weeks turned into months, and the police found themselves stymied. Leads dwindled, and tips that had once arrived in an overwhelming flood now trickled down to a slow stream. Yet even in those moments of discouragement, the community refused to give up hope. Friends of the Closs family organized support groups, offering words of encouragement to each other, reminding one another that Jayme was out there somewhere. Though they didn't know where or how, they held on to the belief that she would come home. As the search continued, the weight of the case grew heavier on the shoulders of the officers working it. Law enforcement struggled with the lack of answers, feeling the emotional toll of the case as they witnessed the pain etched on the faces of those closest to Jayme. Each day, they reviewed evidence and reanalyzed potential clues, determined not to let the trail go cold. The nights grew colder, and winter set in over Barron. The changing seasons brought a mix of renewed urgency and creeping despair. Dole. Officers, community members, and family friends came to terms with the idea that finding Jayme might be more difficult than they'd initially hoped. Yet beneath the discouragement, an unwavering hope remained. There was a resilience in the hearts of everyone touched by Jayme's story, a silent vow that they would continue searching, praying, and waiting for her to return. Jayme had endured nearly 3 months of captivity, each day a blend of fear, isolation, and hope for freedom. But on January 10, 2019, an opportunity arose, one that Jayme knew might be her only chance to escape. That morning, Jake Patterson had told her he would be leaving for a short time, and Jayme sensed something different. She could feel it in the air, a quiet, powerful instinct that whispered to her, urging her to take action. As soon as Patterson left, Jayme summoned her courage. She took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped out into the cold January landscape. Her heart pounded as she made her way through the snow-covered forest, her only thought focused on finding someone, anyone, who could help her. After what felt like an eternity, Jayme reached a nearby road where she spotted a woman walking her dog. Overcome with relief and fear, Jayme called out for help. The woman, startled at first, quickly recognized that Jayme was in desperate need of assistance. She wrapped her arms around Jayme, offering words of comfort as she led her toward a nearby house, assuring Jayme that she was safe now. Inside the house, Jayme was given a warm blanket, and the woman called 911. Despite the emotions coursing through her, Jayme remained focused and clear, providing her rescuers with essential details about Patterson's cabin and his identity. The authorities, acting swiftly, arrived and took Jayme to safety, offering her the reassurance that her ordeal was over. Meanwhile, law enforcement teams moved quickly to track down Patterson. Within hours, they located and apprehended him, ending his ability to harm Jayme or anyone else. Patterson was taken into custody, and news of Jayme's escape spread rapidly. For her family, friends, and the entire community, her return was nothing short of a miracle. After months of worry, heartache, and uncertainty, Jayme was finally safe. In the days following Jayme's escape, relief washed over the town of Barron as they welcomed her return with open hearts and gratitude. The Closs family and community members rallied around her, offering comfort, warmth, and a sense of safety. For Jayme, adjusting to life outside the walls of that cabin meant relearning a freedom that had been taken from her, finding strength in the support of loved ones who stood by her side. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Jake Patterson began swiftly. The investigation moved forward with a clear goal: to ensure he would never again have the chance to harm anyone. Law enforcement meticulously gathered evidence, piecing together the events that led up to Jayme's abduction and the tragic loss of her parents. Patterson's motives, as chilling as they were brought to light, revealing a pattern of calculated planning that underscored the disturbing nature of his actions. As Patterson faced charges, the courtroom filled with people invested in seeing justice for Jayme and her family. Each hearing was an emotional event for those who had come to know her story, a reminder of the heartbreak that had shaken the community. The prosecutor presented a powerful case, one that left no room for doubt about Patterson's intentions or the gravity of his actions. Witnesses recounted the pain that had gripped Barron since that October night, while the evidence painted a vivid picture of the suffering endured by the Closs family. Ultimately, Patterson entered a guilty plea, accepting responsibility for the trauma he had caused. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With the sentence decided, the community breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that justice had been served and that Jayme would never again have to fear him. In the months that followed, Jayme took one day at a time, finding solace in the small steps of rebuilding her life. She became a symbol of resilience, not only for Barron, but for people across the country who had followed her story with hope and empathy. Community members continued to support her, offering a network of friends and neighbors dedicated to helping her heal. As Jayme began the process of moving forward, the world saw in her a reminder of the human spirit's resilience, of strength found in the face of unimaginable hardship. The story of Jayme Closs remains one of survival, courage, and the enduring power of hope, a testament to the young girl who overcame darkness to find her way back to light. The next and final story is called The House of Horrors. On a cold January night in 2018, a young girl slipped out of a modest suburban house in Paris, California. Her name was Jordan Turpin, and at 17 she looked much younger, barely a whisper in the night as she made her way down the empty street. With each step, the fear and excitement inside her grew, her heart racing faster than it ever had before. In her mind, she carried the images of everything she was leaving behind and the faint glimmer of everything she hoped to find. Jordan's mission was clear. She needed to find help, not just for herself, but for her 12 siblings still trapped inside that house. Their lives had been shrouded in secrecy, confined to that house, and bound by rules that Jordan knew weren't normal. She was only a teenager, but Jordan had been silently observing for years, holding on to faint ideas from fleeting TV glimpses and rare moments when she'd read or overheard things that hinted at a different life beyond her family's world. Those snippets of the outside world gave her hope, a belief that life could be different. The house she left behind on Muir Woods Road looked ordinary from the outside, but Jordan knew it held secrets that would shock the world. Her parents, David and Louise Turpin, had always kept their family isolated, closed off from the world. The children were homeschooled, rarely seen outside, and forbidden from interacting with neighbors. Life inside the Turpin home was controlled, orchestrated down to the smallest detail, leaving the children with few choices and fewer freedoms. Now, as Jordan clutched a cell phone she'd managed to sneak from the house, her mind raced through what she would say. She had never made a call like this before, had never been allowed to hold a phone long enough to know its secrets, but tonight was different. This was her chance, a fleeting opportunity to break free. She dialed the number that she'd heard could bring help, 911. Her hands trembled, the cold night air stinging her face as she held the phone close. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end of the line seemed almost surreal, an anchor pulling her into a world she'd only dared to imagine. I ran away from home. Jordan's voice was barely audible, trembling. And we live in filth. My brothers and sisters are chained up. Some of them are chained up. Her words came haltingly, a lifetime of silence weighing down each phrase. But she pressed on, finding strength with every word. This was her only chance to tell the truth. They abuse us, she added, her voice breaking. The dispatcher's tone changed, becoming focused and calm, a lifeline Jordan hadn't realized she'd needed. She felt a mixture of fear and relief, knowing that someone on the other side was listening, really listening. The dispatcher began asking questions. How many siblings were there? Were her parents home? And could she describe the situation? Jordan answered as best as she could, each response painting a picture of a life that, to her, had become unbearable. She spoke about her siblings, about how they were sometimes bound, unable to move freely. Her descriptions were scattered, the vocabulary of someone who had lived her life in the shadows, but her urgency, her desperation, rang clear. The dispatcher knew that this was not an ordinary call, and every word Jordan shared pointed to something far more disturbing than the usual emergency. As she spoke, Jordan's mind flashed to the dim, cluttered rooms she had left behind. The house was a labyrinth of squalor, each room a snapshot of the strange confined world her parents had constructed. The children's rooms held little more than bare essentials, beds with thin, worn mattresses, strewn with odds and ends that spoke to a life of deprivation. Often, they were given food irregularly, sometimes left hungry, other times forced to eat foods that made their stomachs turn. In the darkness, the dispatcher guided her, keeping her grounded in the moment. "Can you tell me where you are now?" he asked, his voice steady, a calm presence amid her fear. "I don't know," Jordan replied, her voice faint. She had never known the world outside well enough to describe her surroundings. She tried to look around, squinting in the dim streetlight to read any sign or landmark. Her voice wavered, but the dispatcher reassured her, helping her to hold on to her courage. Minutes passed, and then she saw the flashing lights approaching down the street. Relief washed over her, but fear crept in alongside it. She didn't know what the arrival of those lights meant, or if this decision would bring the freedom she had imagined. The officer who arrived took Jordan's statement carefully, listening as she recounted pieces of her story, how she had managed to leave the house, the conditions she and her siblings endured. In her quiet voice, she revealed a life that no child should have known. The officers listened to her story, and although they had heard accounts of mistreatment before, nothing prepared them for what lay inside that house. Jordan's description of her home life, the strict isolation, the deprivation, and the fear left them stunned, but it was only a glimpse. As they drove her away from the scene, a quiet determination filled the officers. They knew they had to return to that house on Muir Woods Road to confirm what she had said and, if true, to bring justice for those children. The investigation that followed would unearth a story so disturbing that it would ripple across the world. The truth behind the closed doors of the Turpin home would become a cautionary tale of power, control, and the resilience of children who had known only darkness and isolation. The officers arrived at the Turpin home with a sense of grim resolve, armed with Jordan's words and a mission to uncover the reality behind her account. The house on Muir Woods Road looked quiet, almost too quiet, as they approached. The lawn was unkempt, the blinds drawn, and nothing about it seemed out of place for a typical family home in this suburban stretch of Paris, California. But as they prepared to enter, each officer sensed that what awaited them inside was anything but ordinary. Once inside, the officers were struck by the oppressive stillness that filled each room. The house was dark and cluttered, with an eerie silence that pressed upon them like a weight. As they moved cautiously from room to room, the air itself felt heavy, thick with the remnants of secrets and silence. They found sparse furniture, thin, threadbare mattresses, and an unmistakable air of neglect that seemed to permeate every corner of the home. The children they encountered appeared to be at varying stages of youth, yet their faces seemed drained, their eyes wary and hollow, as though they had lived years beyond their actual age. Most were silent, staring blankly at the officers, their bodies unusually still, their faces lacking the expressions typical of children. Some wore clothes that were ill-fitting, as if they had outgrown them long ago. Others bore evidence of prolonged neglect, thin limbs and fragile frames, signs of the deprivation Jordan had only begun to describe. An officer knelt down to speak to one of the younger children, a girl who seemed hesitant to make eye contact. She flinched slightly as he spoke, but her eyes darted toward him, searching his face with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The officer offered a reassuring smile, speaking softly as he asked her simple questions about herself and her siblings. Her responses were sparse, given in barely a whisper, but they confirmed what Jordan had told them. The officer glanced at his partner, his expression confirming their worst fears. This was no ordinary household. As they continued through the house, the officers made their way down a narrow hallway that led to the back of the home. Here, the air was cooler, carrying an unsettling chill. They paused outside a closed door, hesitant but compelled to see what lay beyond. Inside, they found several of the older children in states that defied belief. Some were chained to their beds, their expressions vacant as they looked up at the intruders. The officers felt a surge of anger and sadness, realizing the extent of control these children had been subjected to. They quickly called for additional assistance, knowing this was far beyond a typical welfare check. In another room, they discovered makeshift sleeping arrangements, with some children huddled on the floor amid piles of clothes and scattered belongings. The sight was haunting, the reality of their isolation and deprivation starkly evident. The officers couldn't help but wonder how this had gone unnoticed for so long, how these children had lived in this condition without anyone outside their family, realizing the horrors within. As the officers moved back into the main living area, they encountered David and Louise Turpin. The parents appeared disoriented, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and defiance. David, dressed in unkempt clothing and with hair disheveled, mumbled responses that offered little insight. Louise, standing beside him, seemed less than concerned, her gaze drifting as if the presence of the officers in her home was nothing more than an inconvenience. Questions were asked, and David's responses were evasive, with Louise occasionally interjecting to explain away their children's appearance and the state of the house. Their answers were thinly veiled justifications, attempts to portray their control over the household as strict but necessary. As the officers listened, however, they noted the disturbing contradictions in their words, their lack of genuine concern for the children's well-being. The story David and Louise tried to present unraveled with each word, exposing a pattern of control and cruelty that left the officers shaken. The more they spoke, the more David and Louise seemed to contradict themselves, weaving a flimsy narrative of homeschooling and protection. But the officers were no longer listening to explanations. They had seen enough, and the conditions of the house told a far clearer story than either parent's attempts at justification. With grim determination, the officers placed both parents under arrest, a realization settling over them that this was only the beginning of a deeply troubling case. As the night wore on, the Turpin children were carefully escorted from the house, each child leaving behind a lifetime of confinement. Some walked hesitantly, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to be reprimanded, while others clung to the officers, seeking reassurance and comfort. For the first time, They were stepping into a world beyond the walls of their home, a world they had only imagined in whispers and fragments. Back at the police station, as medical professionals arrived to assess the children's health, the true extent of their confinement and deprivation became increasingly clear. Many were malnourished, their bodies showing signs of long-term neglect. Medical staff gently examined each child, offering them blankets and food, watching as some ate tentatively, unused to the simple comfort of a warm meal. The caregivers took note of bruises and scars, silent evidence of the children's years of hardship. The quiet resilience in their faces hinted at the strength that had allowed them to survive this ordeal. With each story the children shared, the details of their lives grew more harrowing. They described days that blurred together in darkness, routines marked by restrictions, and the feeling of living within an endless cycle of fear and control. Some spoke of days when they went without food, while others recounted rules so arbitrary and strict that they were unsure when they could speak, move, or even stand. Their words, spoken with a mixture of innocence and pain, painted a chilling portrait of life under David and Louise Turpin's roof. As investigators pieced together their findings, they were left with questions that would take time to answer fully. How had this gone undetected for so long? How could such extreme isolation and control persist without drawing suspicion from neighbors, family, or the community? The lives of the Turpin children had been hidden in plain sight, their reality masked by the closed doors and silent routines of a seemingly ordinary home. Each child's account contributed to the evidence, layer upon layer of a life controlled and contained, filled with hardships that no one had seen or imagined. The images of that night, the dark, cluttered rooms, the children's wary faces, and the silent determination in their voices would stay with each officer and investigator long after the case was closed. And as they gathered every piece of evidence, every account and recollection, they began to grasp the true scale of the life Jordan and her siblings had endured, a life they had finally escaped. As the investigation continued, officers and social workers turned their attention to gathering statements from each of the Turpin children. These interviews would become the heart of the case, revealing a life so tightly controlled and hidden that even the children themselves struggled to comprehend it fully. They spoke in hushed voices, often glancing around the room, as if expecting the past to reappear at any moment. One by one, the children recounted stories that echoed with years of isolation and deprivation. The oldest siblings, who had endured the longest, offered fragmented memories, piecing together experiences that spanned decades. They described a life where the days melted together, marked by rules that had little reason, and routines that isolated them from each other and the outside world. While the siblings were technically homeschooled, they shared that education was irregular, consisting of workbooks that were rarely completed and lessons that were often interrupted. The children explained how meals were rare and unpredictable, sometimes withheld for days as a form of punishment. When food was given, it was often simple, cold, and rationed. Sometimes it would sit out in plain view, yet they were forbidden to touch it, a daily test of obedience. This method of control was all they had known, a constant reminder that their needs were dependent on their parents' approval. The older siblings spoke about times when they tried to ignore their hunger, attempting to support the younger ones through small acts of kindness, like sharing a blanket or a comforting word. These small moments of solidarity became lifelines, reminders of their connection to one another, even in the most challenging of times. As investigators listened, they realized the Turpin children had developed their own ways to cope. The siblings would often communicate through whispers, establishing a system of silent signals to avoid drawing attention to themselves. They learned how to protect one another, navigating their parents' unpredictable rules by forming unspoken pacts. In a world where trust was fragile, they had leaned on each other, creating a bond that would ultimately play a crucial role in their survival. One of the siblings, a girl in her early teens, shared how she had learned to read by secretly copying words she saw on labels or in magazines her parents had discarded. She would practice in silence, not wanting her parents to notice her interest in something outside their prescribed routines. For her, reading became a small escape, a way to imagine a life beyond the walls that confined them. Other siblings found similar escapes, ways to let their minds wander beyond their immediate surroundings. It was this creativity, this determination to find hope in small places, that sustained them through the hardest days. The officers listened intently as the children shared stories of how they had tried to hold on to a sense of normalcy. Birthdays were rarely celebrated, and holidays were unacknowledged. But the children created their own moments of joy, marking the passage of time through subtle gestures and private rituals. One sibling recalled how they would sneak smiles to each other when their parents weren't looking, a quiet rebellion that gave them strength. They knew that even these small acts could bring severe repercussions, yet they persisted, finding resilience in these tiny expressions of humanity. As the investigation deepened, medical exams provided further evidence of the children's experience. Many of the siblings were significantly underweight, some suffering from muscle weakness and delayed physical development. Doctors noted that these signs were consistent with years of restricted movement and limited nutrition. The children's health assessments, each one a testament to the conditions they had endured, would later form a critical part of the case, illustrating the physical toll of their lives under such intense control. In each interview, the children spoke with a guarded clarity, sharing the rules they had been made to follow and the consequences they faced when they failed. They described a household where every action, from speaking to moving, was carefully monitored and controlled. The older siblings revealed how they had developed strategies to protect the younger ones, volunteering to take on punishments or going without food so that the younger children might have a bit more. This self-sacrifice, ingrained over years, demonstrated the profound connection that had grown between them, even in a world that seemed to discourage it. The investigators began to understand that the Turpin children had lived in a paradox, isolated from society yet incredibly resourceful, restricted yet resilient. They had crafted a sense of family from within the confines of their world, holding onto each other in ways that underscored their shared strength. Their accounts, woven together, revealed not only a picture of hardship, but also a story of survival and unbreakable bonds. The revelations from the Turpin children's interviews quickly captured the public's attention, sparking shock and disbelief. As news of the case spread, the world was drawn to the story, stunned by the details of the life these children had endured behind closed doors. Reporters gathered outside the home, cameras flashing as neighbors and community members shared their disbelief, each new revelation adding layers to a story that felt stranger than fiction. News outlets pieced together what little information was known about the Turpin family. Images of the house juxtaposed with words like isolation and control, painting a picture of a life that had gone unnoticed in plain sight. As journalists began delving into the family's history, details about David and Louise Turpin's outwardly ordinary life emerged. They had presented themselves as a devout family, portraying their lifestyle as one of order and strong values. From the outside, their family seemed private but typical, the kind of household that might prefer solitude over social gatherings. But for those who had crossed paths with the Turpins, there were subtle hints that things weren't as they seemed. Neighbors began sharing stories of rarely seeing the children outside, and when they did, the children seemed reserved, often avoiding eye contact and speaking in whispers. This unusual behavior had occasionally drawn notice, but it was easily dismissed. After all, the Turpins appeared polite and kind, never openly causing concern or attracting attention to themselves. Yet, the secrecy surrounding their lives began to take on new meaning as the public realized the extent of what the Turpin children had endured. The contrast between the family's unassuming presence in the community and the shocking reality of their home life was a reminder of how easily suffering can be hidden behind closed doors. In the days following the discovery, social media erupted with reactions from around the world. People expressed outrage, confusion, and sorrow, struggling to comprehend how such a situation could have persisted without intervention. The case raised uncomfortable questions about the systems and safety nets meant to protect children. Community leaders, educators, and social workers began examining the resources available to detect and prevent abuse, considering how many signs might go unnoticed when families live in isolation. The Turpin case had become not just a local tragedy, but a symbol of the silent struggles that can exist in ordinary neighborhoods. Discussions around homeschooling policies and regulations gained momentum, with advocates calling for stricter oversight to ensure children's safety. David and Louise had registered their home as a private school, which allowed them to keep the children isolated under the guise of education. For years, this label shielded them from scrutiny, enabling their control over the children's lives. While homeschooling had given many families the freedom to educate their children in ways that suited their needs, the Turpin case exposed a loophole that, in this instance, had devastating consequences. Legislators and educators across the country began considering reforms, hoping to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. Amid the growing media coverage, there was also an outpouring of support for the Turpin children. People from all walks of life came forward to offer resources, donations, and well wishes, hoping to assist the siblings as they navigated their newfound freedom. The story resonated with many who felt moved by the children's resilience, and communities across the country organized fundraisers and charity drives. These efforts aimed to help the siblings as they transitioned into a world they had only glimpsed through brief, controlled outings. As public attention intensified, professionals involved in the case became increasingly protective of the children's privacy. Social workers, psychologists, and medical experts worked to shield the siblings from the overwhelming media glare, understanding that their journey to recovery would be a gradual, deeply personal process. While the public hungered for updates and insights into the children's lives, those closest to the case recognized the importance of offering them a chance to heal away from the spotlight. The Turpin case moved swiftly through the court system, with David and Louise Turpin facing numerous charges related to their treatment of their children. The charges included counts of cruelty and false imprisonment, each accusation shining a light on the realities of their control and isolation. When the case went to trial, the world's attention was once again drawn to the courtroom, where prosecutors laid out the harrowing details uncovered through the investigation. They presented photographs, medical records, and the children's testimonies, creating a vivid and heartbreaking portrait of life in the Turpin household. During the trial, the children's voices emerged through carefully prepared statements. Some chose to speak directly, while others shared their words through written statements read by advocates. They described lives filled with hardship, but also spoke of hope and the newfound freedom they were experiencing. Their statements moved the courtroom, revealing the courage it had taken for each of them to survive, to protect one another, and ultimately, to break free from the only world they had known. The impact of their words was profound. Observers, including members of the jury, struggled to reconcile the image of the Turpins as parents with the accounts of suffering and neglect shared by the children. The children's resilience shone through, transforming them from victims into survivors. They spoke about their dreams, their desire to explore life beyond their previous confines, and their hopes for the future. Their words were a testament to their strength, a reminder of the human spirit's ability to endure and rebuild. The Turpins ultimately entered guilty pleas, accepting responsibility for their actions and the years of control they had exercised over their children. Sentencing day brought a sense of closure, though it was tinged with sadness and reflection. The judge addressed David and Louise, speaking of the unimaginable suffering their actions had caused and the long-lasting effects on their children's lives. The court handed down life sentences, ensuring that the Turpins would be held accountable and marking the end of a chapter that had forever changed the lives of their children. In the years following the trial, the Turpin children began their journey toward healing, supported by a network of caregivers, counselors, and advocates. Each sibling found their own path, learning to navigate a world they had once only glimpsed through tightly controlled windows. They took steps to experience everyday moments that many people take for granted: walking in a park, learning to drive, attending school. These simple acts marked milestones, symbols of their resilience and their determination to create lives beyond their past. Public support remained strong, with many rallying behind the siblings as they rebuilt. Charities and organizations continued to offer resources, ensuring that the Turpin children had access to education, medical care, and housing. Their journey became an inspiration to others, a reminder of the importance of community, compassion, and vigilance in protecting those who are vulnerable. For the professionals who had been part of the investigation, the case left a lasting impact. Officers, social workers, and medical professionals reflected on the lessons they had learned, their awareness sharpened to prevent similar cases from slipping through the cracks. The Turpin case had highlighted the need for stronger safeguards, and communities across the nation took notice, vowing to create a world where no child would have to endure such hardship unseen. As the Turpin children moved forward, they carried with them the bonds they had forged during their years of confinement, bonds that had helped them survive. Now, those connections became sources of strength as they began new lives filled with possibility and hope. For each of them, the journey was deeply personal, a testament to resilience, healing, and the freedom they had fought so hard to attain. If these stories of survival and resilience left you speechless, Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. There's always another story waiting to be told. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. What part of these cases stood out to you most? Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the darkest moments, there's strength, courage, and hope. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.